This is William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, and in this video I'd like to provide students with some help getting started in the study of Lesson 9 in the Academy's Latin Grammar 1 course. As you can see on the screen here, the title, or the topic I should say, of this lesson is accentuation. Accentuation. In recent lessons, we learned how to divide a Latin word into syllables. And then in the last lesson, we learned how to determine the quantity of syllables, how to determine whether a syllable was long or short. So before getting started with this lesson on accentuation, make sure you're very comfortable with those previous lessons, because we're going to assume you understand how to divide a word into syllables, the names of the different syllables, and how to determine the length or quantity of the syllables. That's all going to be necessary for you to understand the rules of accentuation. So assuming that you're ready to go here, let's go ahead and get started with Article 15, where we learn the rules of accentuation, or how to rightly pronounce the accent on Latin words. We're going to learn the general rules and then a few remarks which really I don't think you'll be able to understand just yet as you get started in grammar, but later, as you work through grammar, you'll be able to come back and understand what those remarks refer to. But let's focus on the general rules at the top of Article 15. In the first part of Article 15, we read the following rule. Disyllabic words have the accent or stress on the penult. Disyllabic words have the accent or stress on the penult. Now, this may look a little confusing because we see two words that are unusual, disyllabic and penult. But you should know penult from the previous lesson on the names of syllables. And disyllabic is really simple. Di just means two. Think like diphthong, two sounds. Disyllabic. Disyllabic words are words that are made up of two syllables. So it's very simple. Disyllabic words, two-syllable words, have the accent or stress on the penult, that is, on the next to last syllable, or the first syllable, since we're talking about disyllabic words, or words that only have two syllables. So the first syllable of a two-syllable word is always accented. And they give us this example of equus, which is not a very good example since it sort of looks like a three-syllable word. But the simple rule is when we see a Latin word that's two syllables, the first syllable is accented. So let's look at some other examples that we've run into. Any of these words, any word that we find that's only two syllables. Here we see locus. So we know that the accent will be on the first syllable, or on the penult. Locus, locus. Here we see anceps, anceps. The first syllable of a two-syllable word will always be accented. Here we see claudo, claudo. Here we see kogo, kogo. The first syllable of any two-syllable word will be accented. That's our first rule here in Article 15. Now, there's no such thing as an accent on a one-syllable word. That's why the rule for accentuation starts with two-syllable words. In the second rule here, we learn about the rule for accents on any other words, any words with more than two syllables. So here's the rule. Polysyllabic words, words with many syllables or more than two, polysyllabic or polysyllabic words, have the accent on the penult when the penult is long, but on the antepenult when the penult is short or common. Common means it can be long or short. So in a word that has more than 2 syllables, we have to look at the or the next to last syllable and see whether it's long or short. If the next to last syllable is long, then it's accented. If it's short, then the antepenult will be accented. So one more time. In a word of more than 2 syllables, if the penult or the next to last syllable is long, then that syllable will be accented. But if it's short, then the antepenult syllable will be accented. Let's look at some examples. We see here the verb. We see 1, 2, 3 syllables in this word. So this is an example of a polysyllabic word. And we see that the next to last syllable is long because it contains a long vowel. Therefore, since the penult is long, the penult will be accented. So we'll say mandare, mandare, because the penult is long. Here we see another verb that looks similar to this one, but we notice that the next to last syllable is short. So it's a 3-syllable word, but the penult is short. Therefore, the antepenult will be accented. And you can see the little accent mark over the ah. So here we read mandare, mandare, and you should understand why we accent that syllable. But here, where the penult is short, we say mandere, mandere. We accent the antepenult, or the first syllable. Here we see the word integrum, integrum. And we see here that this e is marked as common. We see a long sign and a short sign. So we see that it's common. That means the antepenult will be accented. So it looks like integrum, but that's not correct. It should be integrum, integrum, because that second syllable, the penult syllable, is common. Here we have kir, kum, da, re, 4 syllables. So it's polysyllabic. Kir, kum, da, re. And there's no long sign over this penult. Therefore, the antepenult is accented. Kir, kum, da, re. Kir, kum, da, re. Here we see superstites, superstites, 4 syllables. The penult is not marked as long here, therefore the antepenult is accented. Superstites, superstites. So we see the simple rule. If the penult is long, it's accented. If the penult is short or common, the antepenult is accented. So let's look for some more examples. We have the word here, concludo, 3 syllables, so it's polysyllabic, and we see that the penult is long, so we would accent the penult. Concludo, concludo. Here we see tabula. We see that the penult is short. Therefore, this would be read with an accent on the antepenult. Tabula, tabula. And then lastly, we saw this word tenebrai, tenebrai. And if we look at the penult syllable, we see that it's common. Therefore, we'll accent the antepenult. Tenebrai, tenebrai. Okay, so there's some examples for these rules. We have disyllabic words are always accented on the first syllable. Polysyllabic words will be accented on the penult if the penult is long, or on the antepenult if the penult is not long. So pretty simple rules. Just take some practice and some time. Now you may ask yourself, well, how do I know if the penult is long? Sometimes you won't know, especially if you're reading a text that doesn't have vowels marked. The only way that you'll know that is by experience, by carefully studying words and paying attention to know whether those syllables are long or short. That just takes experience and focus on studying the words and studying the length or quantity of the syllables. So that's going to be a challenge that you're just going to have to be patient and gain familiarity with over time. I'll make sure as we go through grammar, I'll make sure to point out, as we go through all the different forms, I'll be sure to point out for you where we've got long and short syllables that affect the accent of words, okay? So keep that in mind. Now there's a bunch of remarks here, 3 remarks in this lesson, and at this point some of these may make sense to you if you've been studying Latin reading, because you may have seen some of these things, but some of them you may not have experience with. So let's just read these remarks, and I'll try my best to explain them in terms that you can understand if you're just getting started. Remark number 1, little appendages that are called enclitics. Little appendages. In English we call them suffixes, words that are added to the end of a word. Little appendages such as que, ve, ne add an accent to the ultimate or to the last syllable of words that are accented on the antepenult. Now that's a lot to think about. Little appendages called enclitics. They're called enclitics because they're really separate words, but they lean back on the previous word. They add an additional accent to the last syllable of a word when that word is accented on the antepenult. So the only way you're going to understand what that means is to look at an example. So here we have the word luminaque. Luminaque. Now the word lumina would be accented on the antepenult. So we would say lumina, lumina. But when we stick this enclitic onto it and say luminaque, we add an accent to the last syllable of the word. So we say luminaque, luminaque. So it adds an accent before that suffix or before that appendage added on to the end of the word, called an enclitic. All right? So we would say lumina for the word by itself, but if we say luminaque, we would adjust the accent to say luminaque, luminaque. Here we have another example. We have the word flumina, flumina. Normally the accent would be on the antepenult, flumina. But we add this enclitic ve or we in classical Latin, and that causes us to add an accent to the last syllable of that word. So flumina, flumina, but with the enclitic added is fluminave, fluminawe. So you can hear how we add that extra accent. Here we have another one. We have vomere or vomere, vomere in classical Latin, vomere in church or Christian Latin. And we can see that the antepenult was accented in that word, vomere or vomere. But because we've added this enclitic, we add an accent on the last syllable, vomerene, vomerene. So if we add an enclitic to a word and that word is accented on the antepenult, we add an additional accent to the ultimate or last syllable of the word. Okay, that's the remark here. So that's one point to think about, because you'll see that. You'll see these enclitics added to words, and you won't know how to pronounce them rightly. You won't know which syllable to accent. Well, this gives you a simple rule. Now, this second part of this first remark you can ignore, because it tells us that there's another way to pronounce these words, but then it says, but it is more likely that the ordinary rule of accentuation was followed. So let's just not introduce any new trouble when it wasn't even commonly practiced. Let's go on to remark number 2. Compounds of the verbs facere and dare, compounds of the verbs facere and dare retain the accent on the verbal form. Now this is going to be confusing to you because you haven't studied verb forms yet. But all that it's saying is when the verbs facere and dare are joined to other words to form compound verbs, the accent remains on the verb. And we're given 2 examples. So here we have the word calefacit, or in church Latin, calefacit. And so we can see that we have the verb facit, with another word added to it, cale, which means warm. I'm not going to even talk about the meanings of these words because it's insignificant. All we need to see is that we have the verb facit, which would be accented on the first syllable because it's a 2-syllable word. And we've got this other word joined to it to make it a compound verb, but we don't accent that word that's joined. We simply retain the accent of the verb itself. So calefacit. Here we have another example. We have the verb dare, which was given here, dare, and we add venum or venum to it, but we retain the accent on the verb, venum dare. Okay, so just a simple note about compound verbs for just 2 verbs. So it's facere and dare. So again, this isn't something that you need every time you read Latin, but sometimes you might not be certain about a pronunciation, and you need to remember that there were rules for accents in your grammar book, and you can go back, look them up, and check to see if any of those rules apply to the word that you're having a hard time with. That's why this, again, is called a reference grammar. There's lots of information in here you're not going to use every day, but once in a while you're going to get stuck, and you can go back and read through the relevant lessons in this grammar book and find some helpful notes. Okay? Next, third remark. Vocatives and genitives, so this is talking about different cases of substantives, that would be nouns, vocatives and genitives of substantive nouns that end in ius of the second declension, as well as genitives of substantives that end in ium, retain the accent on the same syllable as the nominative. And we're giving an example here, vergili. Now, there's no way for you to understand this because you haven't even studied cases yet, but notice that it's talking about substantives that end in ius and substantives that end in ium. So the only time you would need to think about this is if you actually run into a word that's a substantive that ends in ius, and you would remember that there was a note about that in the lesson on accent marks. Okay, so these remarks are not necessarily helpful for you every day, but once in a while you'll get stuck, and you can go back and reread these remarks and often find explanations for things that otherwise wouldn't make any sense. Okay? So that's it for Article 15. Really, all we've got are 2 simple rules, a rule for disyllabic words and a rule for polysyllabic words. Two simple rules that you just have to practice using. You just have to get used to hearing the Latin. Unfortunately, you can't always trust that anyone you hear reading Latin is reading it correctly, so you've really got to learn the rules and on your own practice reading, following the rules, and eventually you'll run into some words that don't seem like they fit the rules or it doesn't sound right. And those things are worth talking about or asking about, but normally you'll see that the rules will give you the best guidance. And then, one good source, this may not affect any of you, but if your parents or someone you know has an old Latin prayer book or breviary, the accent marks were included in the old breviaries. I don't know if they're included in a Latin missal. I don't have a Latin missal on my desk here, but if you can find an old prayer book, an old Latin prayer book, maybe an old Latin missal, you might find one that has all the accent marks written on the words, and that's very helpful for you to practice reading from, to make sure you're getting the accent of the words correct. But otherwise, just learn these rules, memorize them, and do your best to put them into practice any time that you're reading. Normally, you'll hear me read the words correctly, but even once in a while, there may just be a word that I don't get exactly right, or I have to think about, because sometimes these rules can be difficult to apply, because like in rule number 2 here, we have to know whether the penult is long or short, and off the top of my head, sometimes I don't know that. I would have to grab a dictionary and look it up to see the different forms of the word to find out if that penult syllable is long or short. So if you struggle with that, or it takes you a few minutes sometimes to figure it out, that's just normal. Don't think there's something wrong in needing to use a dictionary. That's what the dictionary is for. So take your time, learn these accent rules, and practice with them. And eventually, you'll start to get used to the rhythm of the language. You'll know, like in spelling, you may not know how to spell a word, but sometimes you'll write a word and you just look at it and say, that just doesn't look right. You don't necessarily know how the word should be spelled, but you can just look at what you've written and say, I know that that's not right. It just doesn't look right. The same thing will happen in pronunciation. You'll be reading in Latin and you'll say a word, and after a while you'll get used to the rhythm of the language and you'll say, the way that I said that word, it just doesn't sound right. And usually you can feel when you've got the accentuation wrong, and you can go back, check the rules again, and clean things up. So if you want to try to really pronounce the language accurately with good accentuation, learn the rules, and practice them any chance you get. I hope that's a helpful walk through this lesson on accentuation, Article 15. If you've got any questions, please post them on the forum, and study this lesson, get the assessments done, and we'll move on in our study of Latin grammar. God bless.